For My People by Margaret Walker, a tribute to Crown Heights. For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people, lending their strength to the years, to the gone years and the now years and the maybe years, washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sands of Alabama backyards, playing, baptizing and preaching and doctor and jail and school and mama and cooking and playhouse and concert and store and hair and Miss Chumbi and company. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school to learn, to know the reasons why and the answers to and the places who and the people where, in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different and nobody cared and nobody wondered and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things, to be man and woman, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and to success and marry their playmates and bear children and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Crown Heights in Brooklyn and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people, filling other people's pockets when they really need bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all our own. For my people walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time, being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled, entangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by facile force of state and fad and novelty by false prophet and holy believer. For my people standing, staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves, and all their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control. Crown Heights will rise and take control.
So-called riots that we had back in 1991, August 1991.
And I don't even, people call it riots, and I'm like, how many days did we have them? Seriously.
What riots are you talking about?
The Crown Heights riots.
Oh, you're talking about the Crown Heights situation.
2 years ago, yeah.
The Crown Heights situation.
With that incident in Crown Heights.
The riot that took place here.
The riots.
Crises.
The riots.
Now that I think of it, it was a riot.
Be honestly, when I think back at it, I feel like the news made you think that the whole Crown Heights was on fire. And it wasn't. because we went around our daily lives every day. Nobody was doing on this side, and nobody was, chasing folks. Everybody was just doing their regular thing every day.
So it was kind of concentrated.
It's very much concentrated, but it was concentrated, but the feelings were not. So people was talking about it, but also people see the discrepancies in treatment, whether it be from police or from in the buildings that they live in. They see the discrepancies in treatment.
Cops, they might treat the Jewish people better. What's the situation? What's going on here? And if it's a black person, they're like, what? Acting all rude and everything. And I don't think that's fair. I know they don't, come in all frisk up the guys, like how they, Jewish guys, like how they do black guys and they'll beat them and stuff. Because I'm sure their community leaders would, make a big issue of it. And I don't think that's right. I think it needs to be changed. Because everybody lives in this community and everybody needs to get treated the same way, no matter what. If you're going to treat somebody good and treat everybody good, or treat somebody bad and treat everybody bad.
What they would do over here in New York City, just being black and male, the cops would just stop you and you would have to show identification and they would search you. And if you didn't necessarily have to be up to anything foul, but if they tell you stop, show me some identification. If you gave them some lip about what for and all that kind of stuff, you can be arrested for obstructing justice. And with some of these cops, I damn near got on a first name basis with some of them, because they would stop you when I was coming home from work. They would just stop you, and I'm like, Jack, not again today. What is it? And then you got to show them your ID, and he's like, hey, they've stopped that a lot. But again, in my opinion, the way this thing works, as a result of gentrification, they've slowed that down quite a bit. But the neighborhood is a lot safer now. We have cops. I see cops patrolling my block, which is unheard of in Crown Heights.
It's like completely changed. I can't believe when I sometimes we walk through Crown Heights and I can't believe that this is Crown Heights that my daughter was born and raised. You can't even live there. The rent is so high that it's crazy. That's my anger for Crown Heights. It's just it's really frustrating because yes, I love Crown Heights. It was so, I could walk to the park, I love to walk to the park. Go to the museum, go to the library, just take a nice stroll down to Eastern Parkway, just to relax your mind sometimes and to, come from a hard day work and you just want to unwind, you just take a walk, little music in your ear, just walk on the parkway, and I just love to do that.
The real estate situation in Crown Heights is not good. In other words, the houses are here not available, or if they're available, they're overpriced. So I couldn't see myself buying anything in Crown Heights.
People are getting tired. People are getting tired now. You look around, you can't afford to live in your own neighborhood. Don't think about trying to sell, because like I said, you're not coming back. You won't be coming back to Crown Heights.
We all been living here for years, and then one thing happens and everybody wants to, stereotype it. This Crown Heights is a nice place. This is like any other community. And if you want to find out, you should come here and talk to people that live here. Find out the real deal before you make judgments.
In thinking about this monumental topic, just a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. The first is that for me, as for I think many people, it's kind of hard to think of the life you lived as history of something that belongs in a museum or at the Brooklyn Historical Society or somewhere in some archive. I think like most people, I tend to think of it as, oh, that's not history, that's just some stuff that happened to me. Well, it's history, and it's interesting, and it's only when, for me, it's when you sort of see it written on the page, or you start to get questions from people about what was it like, what did you do, how did you feel, and you start to put it in some kind of a framework, and you start to realize that, it kind of means something to a lot of people. The second observation I would say is that you heard in one of the oral clips someone saying, well, look, for our community, this is really special because our Rebbe is here. This is a special place. This is a holy place. This is, in effect, where we meet God. It's true for a lot of people in that community. We know about the organized religious community there as well, but there is, of course, this other sort of a track that goes on, and I was very glad to see Jamal Gaines open up the show here because, for a generation of us, this was the home of black nationalism, cultural expression, that it was a breakthrough, it was a really special time in the 70s into the 1980s and throughout. And then I guess I'd say finally, I was talking to somebody who sought me out to try and write up something about this history, and one of the things that comes up, and the diplomatic way to say it is, I remember that differently. One of the things that came up is, well, there's this notion that it was outsiders who came and who, sort of were the flashpoint that made the madness of 1991 happen. And I had to say, I just got to reject that, or I remember that differently. We did this to ourselves. We did this together. And if we're going to find a path out, it's going to be together or not at all. Those are my observations. But I want to hear from these folks. And actually, we'll take a quick trip down the panel. And I'd ask you heard a lot of terms used to describe what happened in 1991. What would be your sort of, if you had only about a minute, which is about what I'll give you, if you had only a minute to describe to somebody who didn't know Crown Heights, who didn't really know what happened, but had some sense that there was this explosion that ended up in the newspapers, how would you describe it? What would you say actually happened? What does it mean to you?
You start with me?
Yes, we'll start with you, who has a great picture, by the way, in real time, out there in the middle of it, facing down cops in 1991, the rabbi.
Okay, let me do it from a very personal perspective then, because, there was, I think it was Sunday evening that the car accident happened that sparked the whole thing. And all kinds of rumors went out. And I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Monday or Tuesday, but I think it was Monday afternoon. I was a rabbi running programs at NYU, but I lived in Crown Heights. I'm actually the Crown Heights resident since '73. And I was driving my car down Eastern Parkway, a station wagon. That dates us a little, right? We don't have those anymore. And I had 3 or 4 kids in the back, ranging in age probably from 10 to, 9 to 6 or 5. Actually, I spoke to my son, and he said, he was 6 at the time, he says this is one of his most vivid memories, that he remembers most strongly, one of his earliest vivid memories. And I saw a crowd gathered, and I just thought maybe it's the funeral for Yankel Rosenbaum, who'd been killed the night before, or maybe, as I said, maybe it was another day after that. And so I pulled off onto Union Street, I parked my car at the corner, I got out, and I found myself in the middle of a riot, literally. There was a crowd of Hasidim gathered in front of the synagogue, and there was a march of some of the young people who had been inflamed by everything that had gone on, going along President Street, that was supposed to be marching from the site of the accident to the 71st Precinct. But when they got to the corner of Kingston Avenue, they literally turned and to attack the synagogue, basically. That's how the people saw it there. And there were stones being thrown and bottles. And they were coming down the street, and I have to say that some of the young Hasidim who I knew were actually throwing stones back, but they were just standing there just like, as a human blockade. And the picture that appeared in the Times is me going like this to the cops, you better get in the middle of this right now, because this is going to be very bad. And the cops did set up a barricade at Union Street and stop the riot. So it was something it was very scary. There were people hurt in it. Some people use the word pogrom. I think that's maybe a little bit harsh, but riot, I would definitely say yes.
Hi. So I'm always careful about how I narrate the situation because I'm not a native of Crown Heights and I wasn't actually around. And so a lot of what I understand comes from secondary sources and comes from listening to the archives. And I guess one thing that came or sort of rose to the surface for me is that this event sort of felt like the thing that brought to the surface a lot of the things that had been bubbling beneath the surface. And so I always think about this as a moment when people had no choice but to deal with a lot of the issues that possibly they weren't ready to be uncomfortable about in the past. And so I always think about this as a pivotal moment, an opportunity to have a discussion that may not have had a place or an opportunity otherwise.
Well, just to quickly ground myself in the conversation, I am the executive director of the Brooklyn Movement Center, but I was also born in Crown Heights, have lived there all my adult life. And at the time that the incident occurred, I was working in Crown Heights. I used to work for Clarence Norman, who had an office on Nostrand Avenue between President and Union, I believe, and also worked for Crown Heights Neighborhood Improvement Association, which was on Nostrand between Park and Prospect. So I remember it very well, and as Marlon Peterson, one of the interviewees, said, it was very isolated in terms of the geography. And when we talk about Crown Heights, we think of it in this monolithic way, but it's actually sort of in quadrants, right? Crown Heights above and below Eastern Parkway look very different. Crown Heights east and west of Kingston Avenue look very different. So when I hear the word, I don't use the word riot because as a black person, I'm sensitive to that term, right? Because if a group of white frat boys got together and tore shit up, it would be called, it would say it was a protest that got out of hand or something like that. And so riot is a very racialized word in many instances. And what I do know is, having worked and lived there, is that there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of anxiety in terms of, and we'll talk about this, housing, security. I don't like to use the word occupation very easily because it's a very loaded word, but there was a sense that there were police there that were not protecting black folks, but in fact containing them. And so, you know, we can talk about how those issues continue today, but there was a spark, it lit a fire, there was destruction. It was not completely irrational, but in fact was part of something that had been going on for things that people were feeling not only for years, but really for decades and generations.
When they use the term riot, I think about, they could have said a bunch of young black men causing problems and just fighting, but they didn't. They said riots. And I think that Crown Heights riots was a result of, it was like you had a group of, you have a bunch of firecrackers, and when this incident happened, it was like the match that was threw on these firecrackers and lit it up. Because I moved into Crown Heights in 1979, and there had been different issues amongst the black people and the Jewish people. For instance, I remember a friend of mine, she moved into, I think it was Union Street in like 1978, and the Jewish people burned her house down. So I think when this happened with these two children, Gavin Cato and his cousin, Gavin Cato, being killed, and people were standing there watching it, and when they saw Hatzalah come and take the Jewish man and leave the little black children there, and the little black boy died, I mean, it was like, we're not going to take this anymore. How much more can we take? They've killed one of our black children now. So I think the Crown Heights riots, and also I don't think it was as bad as they said it was, because I live on St. Mark's, and it never came down that far. You know, I think basically it stayed on Eastern Parkway, but I think it was just a thing where people had it and they couldn't take it anymore. And it was just like they exploded. They just needed an incident, and that was the incident. That was like the last straw, the straw that broke the camel's back.
Indeed. It's funny, I live on St. Mark's also, and it really was true. If you didn't want to go over there and put yourself in the middle of it, you didn't have to. And life, you know, as I remember, and I'm talking about over by Franklin Avenue, it didn't really change that much at all, even in the aftermath. It was, in fact, hard to reconcile turning on the television and seeing these scenes and realizing it was only about 4 or 5 long blocks away. But as is true often in New York, if you want to get around it, you can stay out of it. I think what Natherlene said is exactly right, and the next thing I wanted to ask you folks about, which is that there is a difference between the creation of social dynamite and the detonation of that social dynamite. Or what happened in 1991 was the detonation, but it had been building for quite some time, and one of the issues that you hear in the oral history as well is that there's an underlying a question about housing prices. You know, I mean, look, we all wish the prices are where they were back in 1991 in retrospect, but at the time it was more than people could handle. I've also always been struck by the fact that although we live on top of each other, a lot of folk don't realize that with 770 being there and the way the Sabbath works, the people who are connected with that shul, with that synagogue, have to be within walking distance, which in an already tight housing market makes the pressures that much greater. And that's been true for a long, long time. Mark and I both live in homes that our parents were wise enough to purchase in the 1950s. So I don't think, I've never had to try and buy anything in Crown Heights other than buying the house for my father. But I'm certainly aware of what my neighbors have gone through and are going through. To what extent is that still an issue? In other words, you know, I guess as a cautionary note for the present, are we back to making social dynamite?
You want to go first?
Social dynamite.
Well, I don't know. I guess I'll go first. Honestly, I think one of the things that we approached when it came to the 20th anniversary of 1991, and we got together in a room, very diverse crowd, black, white, Jewish, Christian, maybe Muslim too, I'm not sure, but certainly there was a diversity of people who wanted to commemorate that. And one of the things that came out of the discussion was that it's time to change the narrative about Crown Heights. That if you have the press book, I don't know, Errol's in the press business, the media business, right? But somewhere there's a book that tells you how to look at any particular thing that's going on in the world. There's a certain lens that you're supposed to see it through, or people do see it through, or tend to see it through because everyone leans on everybody else. And you would always hear the words Crown Heights prefaced by racially tense or racially charged Crown Heights. And there was some truth to that, and I'll address that just briefly, what was and what is. So there were two factors, I think, that were perceived at least as the main tinderboxes between the Jewish and African American residents of Crown Heights. One was personal security, in other words, crime, and the other was the pressures of housing. And when it was, to be fair, and I sort of, a little bit of the voices that we've heard tonight of talking about, well, the Jews did this to me, or the Jews, and this is certainly something that was heard over time. But in fact, nobody would want their entire community to be judged by the actions of one or two. If it's, we wouldn't like to characterize anything about anybody so just to put it in the framework of those two issues. So the Jewish community resisted the temptation that many of their white brethren chose, which was to run to the suburbs when they were afraid of the changing neighborhood, right? And they decided to remain, to build a community, to preserve a community, to stay and to build rather than to run. And the quid pro quo, what they expected from the city in return was, help us deal with crime, because that was the big issue. And there was a lot of lobbying that went on. I think the Jewish community was a little more organized than other groups at that time, maybe because of this more cohesiveness. It was a more distinct group. And they used that political muscle to get the protection that they needed to be able to feel safe walking out in the street. I mean, we know the numbers, right? It was 10 times the murder rate. Random attacks on the street were very common, which they're not today. Even in 1991, after the riots, there was a young woman called Mrs. Lapine who was attacked in her home and murdered that fall, just not long after. And during the riots themselves, there was the murder of Yankel Rosenbaum, the stabbing murder, and there was also an Italian man who was dragged out of a car, I think, and killed also at that time. So it wasn't all just, a pretty scene. So that was the expectation of the Jewish residents of Crown Heights, was to demand from the authorities the protection that they needed to be able to live in a place that was not terribly safe. The concern from the African American community was more around housing. As Errol said, I think a lot of the Hasidic people wanted to live close to the synagogue. They were, families were growing. Prices were not expensive on the, comparatively at that time. You're talking about, when I remember in the 70s, 40, 50, 60,000, 80,000 for a house. When I bought in, thank God I bought in 2001, it was about 275,000. Today, it's 1.2 million for the same house. So that's gone out of reach. But I think the point there was that there was some resentment that some people who were in certain groups in that community felt that they were being pushed out in some kind of organized fashion, which I don't think was true, but it was definitely a perception. So those were the two issues. Then just to come, and you asked, what about today? Well, today, crime has not ceased to be an issue, but it's not the issue that it was. The whole New York is safer. City government is much more responsive. Many, many different ethnic and cultural groups in the community have responsiveness from government today. There are civic affairs departments and so on that are totally engaged with every single group in the community. And I think that makes a big difference because everybody's getting the attention from the city that we all used to have to fight for years ago. And the other issue is, so that's from one side. And as far as housing, it's out of reach for everybody. My kids can't afford to buy, just like my neighbor's kids can't afford to buy. So, and anyone who's elderly and wants to retire to Florida or North Carolina can do it and probably have a nice, comfortable nest egg. But nobody can afford to live in Crown Heights anymore from those who traditionally lived there. So we're all in the same boat. So I think that maybe sort of makes it a little bit different now than it was then.
Are we going down?
Jump in.
Jump right in.
I think what happened, what the circumstances were back then are a little different than they are right now. You mentioned something earlier that I lived through, which is in 1987, there was a woman by the name of Wilma Mae Reddish, whose home was firebombed, and she lived in Crown Heights, I think President Street, if I'm not mistaken. And no one knows exactly what happened. And to some extent, well, it obviously matters what happened, but there were, prior to her home being firebombed, this is a black woman, prior to her home being firebombed, she reported having people coming to her home repeatedly asking her to sell, that there was all this pressure going on. And I think we've heard it already. There was that sense at that time. I think the Hasidic community, because of the presence of the Rebbe, people are coming there, and there's a fight for resources, a fight for a place to stay, to live. And that tension was very much there at the time, and I imagine still continues on some level. But everyone assumed that Wilma Mays Reddish's home was firebombed by Hasidic Jews. Now, I don't think there was any proof of that. I think some people said they saw some people with black robes running down the street, but honestly, I don't think anyone really knows. And I was also part of a series of protests that occurred afterwards. In fact, that's where I met Yvette Clark and Una Clark. But there was a series of protests afterwards where that was a flashpoint, and what we were protesting, because we didn't know whether the home was firebombed, but what we were protesting was the unequal distribution of city services, which included HBD and DHCR, and the police department and public assistance. And so those things were very much at play there. Today, I think there's this sense that the pressure is coming from without, not necessarily from within. And to some extent, I think you're right. I think we're all facing those same pressures. And the folks who are causing that pressure are in many instances transitory and not necessarily looking to raise families. I mean, the Hasidic Jewish community is growing. They want to stay there, whereas people who are coming through now don't necessarily want to do that. And so when you talk about gentrification and what was happening at that moment, there are some overlaps, but definitely some differences.
Well, I'm Willie Mae Reddish, I'm glad you reminded. I worked with her, and she told me about how the Jewish people would call the cops on them, they would call the cops on the Jews. They would, one of her kids, the ball went in their yard, and it was a big fight and a big thing. And so I don't know. All I know is she told me that the Jewish people burnt her house down. To reiterate on what the rabbi said about the crime and whatnot, the Jewish people on Eastern Parkway, or the Jewish people as a whole, or the Hasidic Jews, they did and still do, I'm sure, get special privileges from the police because at the time of the Crown Heights riots, I worked at Brooklyn Central Booking, and if a Jewish person, a Hasidic Jewish person was arrested, they would have to be out by 6 o'clock on Friday. And all kinds of senators and Congress people and the higher ups were calling to make sure that these people were out by 6 o'clock. Also, there was a police car that stayed, I don't know if it's still there, that stayed on the corner of Kingston, I think, and Eastern Parkway 24/7, okay, to protect them, okay? And I think that it was just a matter of, as usual, people look at black people as being criminals, and if you're walking down the street at a certain hour, young black boys, you're there to rob and you're there to kill. And it's like a fear. It's like they don't communicate with us. There's no communication. If I walk past a Hasidic Jewish person, they won't look at me. And if I say hello, they'll keep straight. So I think it's part of lack of communication. I don't know if that's their religion, that they're supposed to do that, because I do know I've had experiences with other Jewish sects where they're very helpful, and they have programs for underprivileged people, and they're very warm and giving. And now, as you said, the relationship between the Jewish people on Eastern Parkway and the black people in Crown Heights has paled to gentrification. Now, half of the people, the black people that we knew back then are gone. They're not even there anymore. And we have these new people coming in, and like I always say to them, if you don't have an aunt that you can go around the corner and get some food from if you're hungry, or if you don't have car fare, you can get a token from, or you don't have a grandmother, then you're not a Brooklynite. So don't call yourself a Brooklynite.
There's an assumption that pairing policing with efforts to improve safety is the best method, and it assumes that everyone has a historically positive interaction and relationship with police officers, right? And so I think in conversations about safety in contemporary times and during the 1990s, I think one thing just to revisit is that when any community is calling for a particular change or desire, thinking about how that intention may actually impact people in real time, right? So bringing more police to a community that already feels disproportionately impacted by over-policing or over-incarceration isn't going to necessarily improve relationships, it's going to strain relationships. And also thinking about issues around safety and issues around crime not necessarily being the outgrowth of not enough policing, but being the outgrowth of a lot of other structural issues that need to be addressed as well. And so how do we address issues around crime and safety that don't necessarily have to use the police as the only and first front line in engaging with those issues? And in 1991, I was 6 years old, so I can't speak to what exactly was happening at that point. But I grew up in a neighborhood in Northern California where we dealt with a lot of issues. We were the crack capital and the murder capital for quite some time, and now we are other things, which we're famed for. But during that time, policing was the first go-to action, and that didn't work out very well because people just got arrested and then came back and couldn't re-engage with their communities. And so now, 20, 30 years later, now we're kind of like, oh, so you introduce community programs. Oh, you find ways for people to re-engage. Oh, you have rehab facilities. So thinking about when we do have a community issue, how do we approach it in a way that is holistic and doesn't rely heavily on a system that historically has not been a positive force and a positive engagement with all communities, particularly Black communities, given the context of what's been happening just in what we've been able to perceive over the past couple of years.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, it's beyond the scope of this evening, but we should certainly keep in mind that, number one, 1991 was pretty much the homicide peak in the city's history. I mean, 1990 was the actual year, but 1991 wasn't too far away, and it was bad. We're talking about 2,000 murders a year. Side by side with that, some will remember, there's south of the Parkway, the 7-1 precinct, but north of the Parkway is the 7-7 precinct, which had an epic corruption scandal. I mean, epic. It wasn't just cops taking money. This was cops stealing from drug dealers. They would then stay in the location, continue to sell the drugs. Right. It was that far out of control. I mean, the late columnist Mike McAlary wrote about all of it. But it was the Buddy Boys. It was unbelievable. And to then see after the fact that this is what was going on made some of what we lived through, I think, it put it in a different perspective. It wasn't just that there was a lot of crime and the cops weren't doing what they were supposed to do. It wasn't clear who was who, and that added to the confusion in many, many ways. I'd like to ask everybody to talk a little bit about some of what I took away from 1991, which was needing to, I didn't think of it this way at the time, but in retrospect, I would say, sort of model the kind of behavior that we want to see. I was very conscious that although I was busy doing a lot of different things, we were running nonprofit organizations, engaged in political activity and so forth, but that I had an obligation that I had not recognized to make some connections across the Parkway, to always have the phone number, and this is back before cell, but make sure you had a phone number for certain people in the Jewish community, to always answer if they called, and to keep a conversation going, even if there was no crisis at hand. And we actually ended up having, it was exactly 11 years and 1 day after the riots, almost a replay of it with a little girl named Tiamani Gittins. This was in Prospect Heights. This was between, I guess, Washington and Underhill on Lincoln Place. A little black girl playing with her brother, darts out into traffic. A car hit her. She was gravely wounded. It was driven by a Hasidic driver. People started to put their hands on him. They were going to administer some street justice. Some people started to spirit him away. And this was in August. And we were all teed up to see the whole thing happen again. This is 2002. And I remember writing about it because I was so proud that I and everybody I knew came running from all four corners of the neighborhood to try and do what we didn't do in 1991, to make sure that there were people there who could explain what happened. James Davis was alive at the time, and he came and sort of explained, not just as a politician, but as a retired cop, what was supposed to happen and what the cops were going to do, and assured people that he would take steps. Richard Green from,
Crown Heights Youth Collective.
Crown Heights Youth Collective, people who had some stature and some authority just immediately put their credibility literally in the street to try and make sure we didn't do it again. And I was never more proud of the neighborhood than at that moment. And it worked out the way it was supposed to, which is that if there's a traffic accident, it's not supposed to result in race riots. So at a minimum, I think we've achieved that. What are some of the things that you see or that you do to try and, make sure that we're in a community where, if God forbid, the identical circumstances presented themselves, we would get a different outcome?
Okay, well, one of the things, to go back to, I think with the Crown Heights riots that was played out so bad in the news that it was such a big thing, was that we had our first and only black mayor, Mayor David Dinkins, and a lot of pressure and a lot of blame and a lot of political, Giuliani for one, who wanted to be the next mayor. So I think that was one of the things that made like Crown Heights riots so terrible, was that mayor, we had our first black mayor, and it was like, see, you've been elected and you can't do it, okay? And now today, what I'm trying to do is I try to educate my community. I'm in an organization called Crown Heights Tenants Union, which was started basically by one of the gentrifiers, Joel Feingold, and myself. And I got involved because I said, well, this organization is called Crown Heights Tenants Union, and none of my people are in it, so let me go and find out what's going on, and let me try to, change the, the dynamics here, and which I accomplished some things, I guess. But I haven't done it in about 6 months now, but I hold meetings in the library on St. Mark's to inform my community as to what's going on, as to their rights as tenants, as to their human rights, as to their legal rights, and to let them know about this organization called Crown Heights Tenants Union. And I might also add, Crown Heights Tenants Union has been very helpful in, helping tenants who may have problems with their landlords. But a lot of that comes from people who, like myself, who's lived in Crown Heights since 1979. I know the history, so I'm more passionate about it because this is my roots, my life, and I intend to be here and I don't intend to go anyplace. So as I said, what I do is I hold these monthly meetings. I haven't had them in about 6 months because I've been busy, but I hold monthly meetings to try to inform my community as to what's going on. And I think one of the things that long-term Crown Heights residents must do is we have to come together and we have to start to communicate with one another, and we have to put aside, because a lot of my people will have attitudes, that carry on into, that affects us, affects our daily being and our functioning in life, and, so we have to start to put aside these differences, and we have to come together, because I always say there's knowledge is power, and there's strength in numbers. So if you get a lot of knowledgeable Crown Heights residents together, you have power, and we can move and we can do something, because at this point now we're scattered, and everybody is, you know, we have jobs, we have things, children to raise, and they're not looking at the fact that the lady, maybe Ms. Brown, who lived next door, was paying $500 a month, and now she's gone, and that apartment is now $3,000 a month, okay? And she can't come back. And one of the things I also stress to the gentrifiers is when you're in your apartment, stay in there, because if you move, then they're going to raise the rents even higher, okay? And we still can't come back. So that's also one of the things that I'm working on now, is getting them to stay in your apartment and don't move.
I would like to make 2 points on the question of modeling behavior. The one is, while I resist the attempt to sort of collapse what was a very complicated situation into a one-dimensional term called a riot, what I do sort of think that we should acknowledge is that it was a destructive act, and that change can look a lot of different ways, and which is not to say that destructive acts have not led ultimately to positive change. But I guess it leads to my second point, which is, you know, obviously in that moment, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of frustration. But in terms of modeling behavior, my response is, you know, don't get mad, organize. And I think for a long time, Crown Heights had not seen a lot of sort of ongoing community organizing groups. And I think Crown Heights Tenants Union is one. I think, you know, to toot our own horn, the Brooklyn Movement Center is yet another. And so, for instance, when we talk about, where in Crown Heights you see that, it's funny how things have shifted, right? So there is actually a patrol, there's a Hasidic patrol, am I correct? And we are organizing a patrol of our own kind. And it's not a patrol that is looking to mirror what the police are doing. In fact, it's there to hold police accountable, to train cameras on them, to hand out literature about people's rights. And think of that as an entry point into community safety, and not looking at community safety solely in terms of the police are the answer. When it comes to a slew of other issues, whether it be the fact that there are poor food choices, we're building a food co-op. When we talk about education and poor education choices, we're organizing parents. So I don't want to run down the litany of things that we do, but the point is, you know, you either should go out there and try to start something, or at least join something that is happening right now. And in fact, there are organizations in Crown Heights where both Jews and blacks, and some are Hasidic Jews, not a lot, but there's some that actually, there are points where Jews and blacks are coming together, not to sort of hold hands and to sing Kumbaya. I think we know that doesn't work, but to be engaged together in very hard work.
Just to piggyback on that, I think beyond like tangible things that are occurring, I think there has to be a certain disposition where people are okay with being uncomfortable. I think that we really, really love comfort, obviously, but there's nothing generative about being comfortable. And I think once people get to a space where they're okay with being uncomfortable because they understand that that'll move them into a space where things can get done, a lot more work can happen. I think it is very easy for us to say, well, if we can't deal with this, we'll just deal with each other and not deal with other people, because that seems like the easiest route. But it is now 2016, and that doesn't seem like the best strategy for us to employ. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, I moved to New York in 2010 from a small city in California. And one of the things that was very important to me about moving to Crown Heights was I did a little research about the community, but I also wanted to move into a community that felt similar to my home community, and it felt like it was a community that I could in some way be involved with and be engaged with. And I decided to teach in this community, and I decided to do a lot of everything that I could possibly do centered on using the businesses in this community. And I think that for people who are new, particularly as people in our 20s and our 30s who are moving here after school or moving here because we think Brooklyn is a cool place, we have an even more heightened responsibility to actually engage with the people in our community. And so one of the first things that I did when I did move here is I just walked up and down the street and just spoke to people and like went into businesses and tried to figure out what was going on. And I feel like a lot of times when new people move into Crown Heights, there is a sense of, I moved in, I won't be here that long, so I don't have to invest in engaging with people. But I think that we have a responsibility as new people to engage, because we then become part of the problem when we sort of shelf off the issues and say the older people who have been here forever will figure it out, but we're here now and we have a responsibility because we are also not helping rent issues here also, but because we're human beings and we're physically in the space. And I think the work that Weeksville is doing, I think the work that this Historical Society is doing is important, because I think part of the issue also is providing discursive space for as many people as possible to share their stories, because a lot of the issues that I think came out of 1991 were concerned with people having tangible issues around housing or policing, but it's also this issue of not feeling like you are heard. And so thinking about what avenues and outlets exist in communities where people can feel like not only are they heard, but action can occur, and that action is not so gradual that they can't actually see the change in their lifetime. And so as I'm hearing you guys talk about the organizations you work with, I think that's a powerful reminder that people will stay mad unless they either build or are given an opportunity to have an outlet that is productive, right? So if you're upset about something, you can't just be upset. That's going to go somewhere, and usually it's not going to go to the person that is most angering. It's going to go to the person that's closest to you. And I think the last point that I just wanted to reiterate is, as an artist, I think it's also important to think about the roles that art play in communities as well. And there's a photographer, Jamil Shabazz, who spent a lot of the 80s and 90s documenting all parts of Brooklyn. And the thing that I think is powerful about his work is that his whole effort was around how do we present a different narrative about Crown Heights and about other neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and giving more space for artists to operate as community engagers and not just people who exhibit in galleries. Like, we as artists should be working in our communities to provide opportunities for people to express themselves, but opportunities for people to take part and be a community rather than just people who pass in and through a community. Because that's not a community, it's just like a highway. It should be in it, not just passing through it.
And I would say that to go back to where Errol was talking about in introducing this question of what the takeaway. So from Crown Heights Jewish Community Council, actually before I've been involved in it, so going back to very soon after, engaged with people like Errol, with James Davis, with Richard Green, with people with the Reverend Norman, who just passed away, who was a tremendously great person in this effort of bringing the community together, of getting the contact information. Hanina says at the 10-year anniversary it was beepers. That was the way that we connected. But so that when something happens, and things do happen, there was a shooting of a deranged person in 770 in the Lubavitch synagogue within the last year or so, where that could have turned into something very terrible. But it happened late at night. By the time people woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning, instead of hearing all the false rumors, there was a video out there, the cops were engaged, the community affairs people from the city were engaged in getting out the story so people are calm before they even got upset. So that work goes on, and certainly our organization, I'll join in, we're allowed to toot our horn a little bit, does serve the entire community. We have seniors who are longtime residents of Crown Heights coming into our office to get help with their scree to keep their rent down, or to help with their benefits, Social Security, whatever it is. And our organization does that as a matter of course and works with that so that everybody in the community can be uplifted all together. So bringing people together, helping the entire community. And by the way, I live on one of the very diverse blocks in the community, and all my neighbors, I say hello to them, they say back to me, except for the guys that moved in from Park Slope down the block there.
Oh, Park Slope.
at the fair that we, I'm sorry, at
No, just talking to the
805 St. Mark's?
The-
Oh, I'm sorry. No, were you at the fair, the housing fair, the fair that I had in my building at 805 St. Mark's?
Yes, I was there. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There you go. United by a common foe, right? It would, in fact, I think, be an ignominious final chapter to the neighborhood if we went through all of this trauma, finally got back together, and then we all got pushed out by investment bankers. Right? So I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. We're going to invite you all to join the conversation. There are folks who are going to circulate with microphones. I would just make a mention of something I saw, and I just put this out there as a kind of a positive sign of where things are heading, I hope. My son just turned 11, and a few weeks before that, I took him and his cousin out to Brower Park, as I often have, and, you know, it was a Sunday, and they're shooting hoops, and I'm shooting hoops with them, and then, you know, a bunch of Hasidic kids came in. This is all around lunchtime, and we adults had the good sense to simply fade back and let them figure it out. And I just sat and very happily took a couple of pictures that I tweeted out of my son and my nephew playing 2-on-2 basketball with two Hasidic kids, all engaged in the true religion of Brooklyn, which is basketball. I'm sort of eyeing their fathers, and they're eyeing me, and I got the sense that there was a certain kind of hopeful wariness, maybe weariness, and I seriously hope that my son reads about these things in a book someplace, a dusty book on a shelf, and that he's living an entirely different and hopefully better life in this house that we cannot afford to sell.
I'm New York State Assemblywoman Annette Robinson, and I was anxious to come this evening when my daughter told me about what the program would be about. It so happens that in 1991, I was a member of the staff of New York Congressman Major Owens. And it so happened that I was his chief of staff. And what happened was I was taking care of a family member, and I had to call my staff person to ask him to get into the street, because I had seen on television that this incident was taking place. And so as a result of that, we began to be engaged. So as I listened to the scenario, I was thinking about how the congressman's office was actually engaged, and also that the office was the staging for much of the information that was being disseminated from the mayor's office, because the mayor's office had set up an office in the congressional office. And so it was my responsibility then to ensure that everything was in place. I walked the streets, so I knew and saw exactly what was going on. I visited the family of Gavin Cato and his cousin. So what I want to say is this, is that much of what has been discussed in regards to Mayor Dinkins, what happened as a result of that, Mayor Dinkins lost the mayoralty. Because what happened was, it was said that the mayor failed to encourage the police office to be more forceful. Also in regards to that, there was a Crown Heights report that came out from the state. And so therefore there was a lot of synergy that was working at that particular time. The mayor had attempted to put some things in place because it was a hotbed at that particular time. He introduced the midnight basketball. He introduced, what was the name of the program? The Beacon programs that are still operating in the schools now, which has more of the community school effect, community school effect, which has, wraparound services. So that's what he put in place. And so I say, as you described and talked about the tensions, there was a lot of tension, but then you had Reverend Jackson from Medgar Evers College, who was President Jackson from Medgar Evers College, who also was engaged in the process and was actively and served as one of the chairpersons or conveners of a council of people to be able to talk about the issues and concerns of Crown Heights and to hopefully to bring some healing. And so Richard Green was also a major part of that I worked with as well. So certainly this conversation is so needed and necessary because we always must tell the story of what took place and how we can come together to resolve some of the differences that take place in our community. You know, just like I don't live in Crown Heights, I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so likewise, the same things are going on over there as well. You know, my colleague told me yesterday that a house on his block sold for $2.8 million. $2.8 million on a street in Bedford-Stuyvesant on Putnam Avenue. And so I'm saying this to say that we have to work together because housing is a major issue. And I know that when you talk about telling people to stay in their apartments, because vacancy decontrol will take over, and therefore that apartment goes up. But we're trying to ensure that we minimize that vacancy decontrol issue so that people can continue to stay in their homes. So I certainly want to thank you for all of the panelists that have participated this evening in sharing this story about what happened in Crown Heights and some. Thank you.
Thank you. I heard the late Reverend Norman's name mentioned, and it reminds me that part of the diplomacy that was required to sort of bring the neighborhood back from the brink included parking a police car in front of the First Baptist Church of Crown Heights, not because there was any particular danger, but because they had one in front of the synagogue down the street. And I thought, you know, on one level, maybe it's a waste of resources, but if it helps bring the neighborhood back together and presents visually some sense of equity, it was probably time and resources well spent. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm the former director of the Brooklyn Children's Museum right in Crown Heights. Okay. And I was not director during the 1991 period, but I did work there for 20 years, so from a programmatic standpoint, I was involved in how to teach the kids about issues that were going on in their neighborhood and beyond. And right after this incident, we brought an exhibit into the museum called Face to Face about dealing with racism and discrimination. And it was an exhibit that Houston had rejected because they said, our kids are not old enough to see this. And I thought, you know, you have to start really young. And I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are about hope and how children can really play a big part because they're forming their attitudes about other people, whereas we, as older people, have much more prejudice, or it's harder for us to change. So I think investing in younger kids is important, but we have to believe that they will comprehend and be able to do something with the knowledge. Because I think children's safety is really a big question in all of the communities. We actually did a survey of kids in Crown Heights about what their concerns were about in the community. And the top concern was safety. And we thought it would be something about culture or, you know, access to resources, but it was really about safety, just as it is in many other neighborhoods. So I learned a lot working there.
Well, you obviously planted some good seeds. Because the Children's Museum has been a very, very active player, especially more recently in bringing the community together. And in fact, Brow Park is going to be the center of this event on the 21st, which was mentioned earlier. And there is a lot. The coming together is tremendous. And as you said, it's not necessarily because of the cultural differences, the religious differences, the differences about the way that we handle gender issues in our community. It's difficult to bring children together in a social setting. But there have been a number of wonderful things. And one of the things that's been one of the most powerful images I have this year was when there's a mural that's been created called the One Crown Heights mural. It's an effort also of Councilmember Cumbo. and it's going to be placed on a wall on Lincoln Place within the next few months. And it depicts scenes from the Hasidic community, from the Caribbean community, the Labor Day parade, and all kinds of different things. Sort of two sides, but a middle where things cross over and join. And this was created by children in an after-school program. And one of the days, the painting days, was at the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and the canvas was laid out on some tables, and all children of all different ages and races and you know, the whole variety were there, and everybody can paint by numbers. It's just a great activity that just brought people together, and it was special to see, and then you'll be able to go and see the results of that in the One Crown Heights mural.
Good evening. My name is Gordon Skinner. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I also was a member of Mayor Dinkins' program called Increase the Peace, which was a program in the New York City Department of Education, or the New York City Department of Education at that time, serving as peer mentorship and peer mediation. I also recall, and I never referred to the Crown Heights incident as a riot, but as an uprising, largely because the disparities and inequities actually preceded the Dinkins administration, and certainly went as far back, if not further, than the Beam and Koch administrations. However, I had the opportunity of doing an interview with Mayor Dinkins and spoke to him about the actions that he implemented in resolving that particular conflict. Conflict often offers opportunities for conversations we might not otherwise like to have. And as a result, he was able to implement, and I don't want to say single-handedly, but he was able to implement a group of different religious leaders and other political leaders that were based in Crown Heights that resulted whenever there was any issue, any type of violence or potential conflict, all of these leaders came together and held an immediate press conference saying that this was not either racially motivated or what have you. So my question is for the panel: do you believe that such a collective body, provided if it still exists, can be brought together to not just look at the issues of conflict and violence that continue to occur, you know, across the divide, but ways that they can actually recognize that, as Mayor Dinkins referred to, this wonderful mosaic that is an amalgam, and that our diversity is our strength, and that we have more in common, and that we should start having these conversations about the commonality of the neighborhood, as opposed to waiting for situations that occur to talk about we're not victims, or this bad thing has happened, how we can actually solidify and really look at Crown Heights as a wonderful mosaic.
I guess one thing that I'm curious about is what it means for individuals to represent a particular community, and what happens when those individuals who represent that community don't actually speak for like the diversity of opinions and feelings within that community. And so I think what I would be more interested in is some type of intergenerational grouping of people that are engaging in conversation, because I think what often happens is that you'll have very young people like the ones that I taught, and you'll have older folks who've been in the neighborhood, and there's not a conversation about things that are going on. So I think I'm less interested in people representing other people and speaking for them, but having a space where people who are 12 can be engaged in conversations with people who are 30, 40, and 50 about this, but the goal not necessarily being whenever something happens, there's a press release or a press statement that this isn't about this, but actually to say maybe it was about this, and here's what we're going to do, but providing space for people who are normally not part of a political process to be involved in a political process of engaging in dialogue and making decisions about things.
Yeah, I also want to say that I really do think we have to sort of broaden our view of what peace looks like, and what it looks like to actually, for people to work together in a collaborative way. I mean, I don't know the full story of it, but it's my understanding that when you look at the Crown Heights Mediation Center, for instance, they came out as a result, that was started as a result of what happened in '91, I think it began with a model similar to what you're talking about, and the idea of not just having spokespeople, but sort of a place where people can come together and their differences can be worked out. And I think it quickly pivoted to something very different. So, for instance, you have violence interrupters working there and focusing primarily, actually. I mean, it's run by Amy Ellen Bogan, who is a white Jewish woman, not Hasidic, but focuses a lot of the work on black young people in Crown Heights, and now is branched out to Bedford-Stuyvesant as well. But the point is that the work, I think you have to meet people's direct and self-interest, and it can't be just about, let's get together and get along. It's got to be rooted in some actual work where people are going to have to interact and deal with like real situations, real crisis, and not sort of try to work it out in some kind of utopian bubble. I don't think it's going to work that way.
No, and I also think that, well, I think in August they're having a family day or something with all different people coming together. But I think you have to, first of all, I think it has to start with the youth now, because they're the future, and you have to meet people where they're at. You can't have a center, let's say, where you say, come and talk and let's discuss this. You have to do something that they can relate to, the youth can relate to, something that they will get enjoyment out of doing. And where, for instance, we're having a rally and a picnic Saturday, Crown Heights Tenants Union, because someone came up with the idea, if you want to get people's attention, have a barbecue in a park, and people are going to come. So this is one of the things that I think that we need to start coming together to do, is to have, which, by the way, Brooklyn was always, we always had our block parties, and now due to gentrification, sometimes the police are called because there's too much noise for the gentrifiers, but this is what we're used to. But this is where, this would be a starting point. You know, I don't want to just say have a party and invite everybody, but something on those lines to get people's attention, to get them to come, to let them know that it's going to be something in it for you. You're going to enjoy yourself. You're going to have fun. People, now with these, we need to have more fun.
That's a great thing. Yeah, I just want to add that just in what you said, first of all, you know, there was definitely a lot of good work that was done immediately in the aftermath, including by Mayor Dinkins. Interestingly enough, everyone spoke about the police car outside 770, but actually, when Ed Koch became mayor, and he was a Jewish mayor, the first thing he did almost was take that car away. He said he didn't feel comfortable with the idea as a Jewish mayor favoring one over another, and you know, we were angry about it, but that's what happened. And then it only came back with the terrorism threat, and then this became one of the, you know, citywide landmarks that needed protection. So then with the terrorism threat, it came back. But what I wanted to say with a lot of this work is going on. I think what you spoke about, I mean, there are many groups that are coming together and doing, we certainly, Crown Heights Jewish Community Council, have been convening people. There was the knockout punching going on in the street, and we had a really good event where we brought the educators in. And I think when the leaders meet, I think it does trickle down and people get the message that, you know, people looking at it different. I don't think it may not be the end, we need to do more, but I don't think I wouldn't put it down in the sense that I think it has an effect. And that work continues. So I think that I hope we're going in the right direction. I think the city learned a lot of lessons that have continued to be implemented. I think the police department learned a lot of lessons, and they were a lot of the focus of the upheaval then was directed against the police, and I think that there were a lot of lessons taken. So hopefully we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd argue a little for the utopian bubble in the following sense. And I think it's both naive and also realistic and maybe even a little pessimistic at the same time, which is that I think what we need and what works is to be character witnesses. You know, so I don't think of myself as a leader. I don't run an organization or anything like that, but I happen to sit in people's living room every night. And I would just say, look, I know this guy. I would vouch for him. I think he's a good guy. I don't know if everything that went on with his organization or his community is perfect or anything like that, but we have to start with where we are, which is true. And I think where we are, we shouldn't hide that from people, is that some of us know each other, and in a community of, what are we even talking about, 300,000 people? If several hundred of us know each other, we should let people know that. And I again, somewhat pessimistic, but to me, 1991 is the sort of the low point. And so people come to me and suggest certain things. Oh, why don't you write about this? I found this injustice, or I found that injustice, or we're going to do this march, or we're going to file this lawsuit. And I say, well, look, the number one rule is we're not going to burn down the neighborhood again. Okay, so let's work backwards from that. Let's see how we can achieve whatever good goals you want without burning down the neighborhood. And I think if we don't, as older people, if we can't at least bring that to the conversation, then we have wasted 25 years, right? I mean, the number one thing we should let people know is that you don't realize how quickly this can go south and how bad it can be, and how a set of seemingly unrelated, innocent mistakes can lead to a tragedy. So I hope we won't lose that we should certainly bring out of this anniversary.
I guess I was wondering, there's a certain kind of discourse of diversity, right? Where we sort of celebrate our differences and talk about them and so on. And I think I hear from a lot of you that discourse of diversity tends to sort of distract from more material issues quite often. But on the other hand, it can be quite powerful, as a kind of utopian sort of vision and a way to mobilize people. But I'm wondering how you sort of from the left critique that idea of diversity and bring it down to earth and make it sort of more material and sort of fight with people for kind of real substantive change. Because it seems to me it's a kind of a discourse of politicians, of the powerful, and it allows us to ignore a lot about what actually goes on. And whoever is interested in answering that question, a lot of you have been kind of engaging with it in your own way during the panel. Thanks.
I'd be more than happy to talk about this. I feel like I went to college in the time period where the go-to solution for everything was to diversify everything. So if you have an all-white student government, then add a black person to that student government. If you have an all-white basketball team, find a black person, put them on the team. And I think the problem with discussing diversity in lieu of talking about structural issues and distribution of power is that diversity becomes almost an ornament, and it doesn't actually address the issues around who has power and who doesn't have power. And so even this conversation around the riots, I think one thing that we didn't get to really talk about is the power differential in New York City. Many of us are struggling with housing prices, but the people who are being pushed out and ending up in shelters in East New York and Brownsville and outside of New York City are majority black people. That's what's occurring. And so thinking about how do we shift our conversations around let's all be happy and greet each other when we see one another, or be happy that there's a lot of different people in the room, to how do we actually create equality in who has power and who has the opportunity to speak in these spaces, and who has the opportunity to not have to move, or who has access to resources when they do get evicted or are under threat of being evicted. They have the clout and access to resources to go and do something about it. And so for me, I'm very much invested in thinking about diversity as a nice thing that we can do, but it's not the end-all be-all. And I would much prefer having people who have a diverse point of view about getting to a particular point than just to have a bunch of different color faces in a room, because we can all have different color faces and have a perspective about the world and how we move forward that is not very much different from a centrist policy that doesn't actually redistribute power at all. And so I feel like I've gotten to a point in my own political understanding that there are things that are the easy work and there are things that are the hard work, and we get to this point where we start celebrating the easy work. It's we populated a room with different people, and that's the very, very, very easy work, and that's the easy work that a lot of organizations are engaged in hiring process. But I think it's when you ask someone to give up privilege and you ask someone to make a sacrifice, I think that's when everyone gets uncomfortable, and that's when everyone's like, or we could just diversify. And so I want to move it away from diversify and actually, really pick up questions around who has power in Crown Heights to be part of these conversations, who has power to move and get up when they need to, who has power to leverage city officials when they need to, who has power to open things and close things and buy things and get loans and things of that nature that are really about money and power, because at the end of the day, that's what moves things is power. And many of us don't have it, and many of the people who don't have it are people who are not white.
Right.
Hi. Oh, cool. I did have some critical questions that I wanted to ask, but I decided I just wanted to make a comment just to say thank you so much for the talk today. I was one of those people that did not want to move to Brooklyn. I was a little bit before that trend when I moved here. And so hearing your stories today, I'd always been interested in what had happened during the Crown Heights uprising, riot, however you want to define it. So it was great to hear it firsthand from all of you. Secondly, I just wanted to thank the Weeksville Center. My background is nonprofit, and so I used to have AmeriCorps come here from all over the US, and they were building affordable housing here in Brooklyn. And one of the best ways, if you haven't been there, is to visit that center. It's just a brilliant museum. We always used to get a talk on the history behind it, and it gives you a 100-year perspective, am I right? Or more, on the history of Brooklyn and housing, which is an issue here. The one critical perspective I would say is obviously working with young adults and millennials generation. One of the important factors I personally think is the housing crisis that exists in America and New York City, is something that generation face and the older generation don't. And I think that's important to factor in as a transient community that you see in Brooklyn. And also the fact that, for the generation that are graduate students, they have phenomenal high student loans that also don't afford them things that a different generation would. And I think that's important when we have these conversations to also talk about.
One of the things I think you'll be very surprised about, though, is the extent of poverty within the Jewish community. As a Crown Heights Jewish Community Council, and there was, I would say, 40% of our families are living way below the poverty line, people paying 70 and 80% of their income for housing. And that's not an exaggeration. I mean, I called one family that had taken from our food pantry a year before for Passover, and we were trying to figure out how to set it up, and I just did a little personal survey. I just wanted to know, what benefit did you have from what we were able to provide? And at the end of the conversation, I said to this young man, just do me a favor, you have 6 people in your household. What's your monthly income? He said about $2,500. How much you paying in rent? $2,000. How do you survive? So poverty is color neutral. It's not. You can do numbers, but the bottom line is that every society is made up of a lot of individuals, and there are a lot of individuals in every segment of the community who are really suffering. And we have to do what we can to help as best we can.
Yeah, I understand that, there's poverty in the Jewish community also, yeah. And, but one thing that, Jewish people, they stick together when they have organizations that you help, not only Jewish people, you help everyone, but you have those organizations. But we as black people, we not only have poverty to deal with, we not only have gentrification to deal with, we have discrimination to deal with, we have our black sons and daughters and fathers being murdered by police, And we have all of these things, and we have black on black crime, but we have all of these things to deal with also. And when, you're wondering about if you're going to be able to stay in your apartment next month, not because you don't have the money, but because your landlord may do something or find some kind of legal loophole to perhaps get you out. And in the meantime, in the back of your mind, you're also still, you still have this, how can I put it, this thing, this hurt from a black man being murdered by the police. You still have this thing where you have a black son or a black grandson or a black nephew that you're really afraid that he could be murdered also by the police, and nothing is done. So we have all of these things going on in our lives also. So diversity, that's fine, but when you're sitting with a group of people and you have all of these things on your heart, it's kind of hard to sit and say, well, hi, okay, what's your name? Yeah, we have to, I don't know, more has to be done for black people.
Can I just say one thing? I feel responsible to say this. I want to push back around this notion that poverty is color neutral. I just think that's historically not accurate. I think that poverty disproportionately affects non-white people in a particular way. We don't have time to go into the intricacies of slavery and capitalism now, but I want to make that very clear, because I think one thing that happens when we conflate all of poverty and say all people who are poor experience poverty in a particular way, we conflate and sort of erase the nuances of what it means to be black and poor in America, which is a very different experience than to be read as white and poor in America. So I just want to emphasize that, because I don't like. I don't want us. I think, given that we're in a historical society, I think that nuance and specificity in language and specificity in numbers and specificity in the history that we're referring to is particularly important. So I want to emphasize that. And I'll leave it there. Other people should talk. I'm done.
We're going to take two more questions because we're a little bit over the time that we had promised you, and we want to have some time to meet and mingle as well.
Thank you. I'm a resident of Weeksville. I'm so glad we're all here tonight. Thank you all. I want to shine a light on a project that's happening now in Crown Heights that I think touches on art, and it touches on communication and oral history. It's very exciting. It's called We Are Crown Heights. Has anyone heard of it?
Is that the oil paintings?
The oil paint. I want to mention it because there have been a lot of themes. There was an artist a year ago who began democratizing the idea of people sitting for portraits. And he has found 200 residents. They sat, because oil paint is slow, for 4 hours, and he took oral histories. There are 200 oral histories. And I'm picture number 11, my husband's picture number 34, but the artist Rusty Zimmerman, who first came to light through DNA info, had the ability to recognize the flaw within his own project early on, which is there wasn't enough variety. And he reached out deep into the community. We ran into him at community board number 8 at a neighborhood discussion meeting. It's diversified. I like the word. It's diversified to, now you name it, there is representation. Old, my demographic, young, white, Jewish, Muslim. There are 200 portraits, 200 oral histories. And on September 25th, he's going to take a marching band from the Grand Army Plaza down Eastern Parkway and end up at your museum. It's going to be, because the Children's Museum was wonderful enough to stage that whole exhibit for another month. And he's working to get all the oral histories put into a book. To me, I just want to shine a light on it because I think that it does speak to the present and the future. In terms of people speaking of their individual experiences of Crown Heights, he gets them to comment on the neighborhood without any cross-judgment by somebody else. So if one person calls it a riot, no one's there to correct them. If someone else calls it a pogrom, no one's there to say, that's ridiculous, which I heard this evening. So everybody's perception is treasured in that project. So I'm only shining a light on it. It's called We Are Crown Heights.
Yeah.
I don't work for him, but I think we would be happy to have that be part of our rich community. Rusty Zimmerman is the name of the artist, Rusty Zimmerman. We Are Crown Heights. Keep an eye.
Okay.
Has
thank
anybody
you.
else?
Portrait 11. Thank you.
Portrait 11.
Hi, my name's Krista, and I'm new here, and I came here tonight to try to educate myself, and I just have a question for the panel. What's your vision of maybe Crown Heights in the next 20 years? Do you see your kids living here in your homes? What's it look like? Do you think your vision will match reality?
That's a good one to finish
Wow,
with.
yeah, right. I had a version of that down as a question, but I didn't want to ask it. My own vision is that we continue forward. I don't have any bright or good news about the housing pressures. It is a very desirable neighborhood in a very desirable part of town with a lot of great institutions and a lot of good people. And all of those are magnets for a lot of money that is sweeping out of Manhattan and other places. Because as inflated as the prices are, that same $2.8 million might get you, 2 bedrooms on the east side or something like that. And so people are coming. And all of the things that we fought for, a community that's much safer, a community that's more cohesive, a community that has things like the Barclay Center, love it or hate it, it's a draw, things that have happened that we all fought for. The rebuilding of the Franklin Avenue shuttle, for those who remember it, I thought was one of the first steps. It is going to bring a lot more people, so I don't know that it's going to be what it has been. That's as far as I would go in that direction.
Well, I think that this whole thing that's happening now, in about 10 years, it's going to turn back around. And I think in 20 years, we're going to be like the old Crown Heights again.
I think Crown Heights has always been sort of, politically speaking, kind of like the sleepy cousin to Bedford-Stuyvesant. And I'd like to see that change. And I think that I'd like to see more organizing groups. I'd like to see more civic engagement happen. But it's hard not to agree with Errol. I mean, when my grandmother moved in that house, the house where I live in 1952, and for most of my life, I never saw nary a white person on my block. And this is not good, bad, or indifferent. It's just what it is, right? And in the last 10 years, I would say 80% of the people who are now owning, and I would say 75% of the people who are renting are not black. And so it's already, it's there. And I think we have to recognize that and try to see what we can preserve in the meantime. And obviously, Weeksville is a part of that. Brooklyn Historical Society is part of it. But I think that we should not go gently into that good night. You know what I'm saying? And resist and try to find policies and structures that support long-term residents and people who want to hold on to their homes and leave them to future generations. That's what I'd like to see. But it's going to be tough because you're fighting market pressures and market forces. And so we just have to find a way to fight that.
Others?
I was just going to say that we had a meeting of the Board 9 is the community board in south of Eastern Parkway. And they had a visioning meeting. What's the future going to be? And they had a historian come. So that's very apropos to being here. And the historian said, well, I look back at Crown Heights over the last 100 years since it was built, and the story always was the old people resisting the new people coming in. over several different iterations. So I don't know where it's going. There is definitely, one thing is for sure, some things are going to change and some things are going to stay the same. What we can hope is a couple of things. I think we can hope that one of the things we need to do is get away from the group towards focusing on the individual and the individual need, because I think that that's where we can make the most difference, is in helping each other and seeing to it that the transition for whoever is affected by it is, smooth and the uprooting and is minimized. And we'll pray together and live together, and hopefully we'll see some good things come out.
Okay, I think that is going to be our last word. Thank you all so much for your attention and your participation.